Great, thank you. Can you hear me in the back? Perfect. So thank you, Igor, for inviting me, and thank you, Ithaca College, for having me here. I actually do come to Ithaca College once every semester as a guest in the new media program for indie media. And that's really great because the students are always very engaged, ask a lot of questions, and I appreciate that. As Igor alluded to, one question you may have is, why are we in separate rooms tonight? And we're in separate rooms because that was the choice that was made. Such is my life that I actually do Google searches every day for things related to the academic boycott, and I saw that Professor Chaffetz would be speaking at Ithaca College. So I emailed two of the professors who were the sponsors and said, hey, I think it would be really great to have us in the same room so the students can hear both sides of the issue, because you may or may not know that I'm one of the most active people against the academic boycott. The response was, we'll give you 5 minutes. I said, that's not really meaningful. I said, well, since you're academic units, you're not private organizations, it's not Students for Justice in Palestine or Hillel, two different organizations. These are academic units sponsoring the event. I said, well, if you don't want to give me more than 5 minutes, would you sponsor a talk by me to follow that? And they said no. So I reached out to Hillel, and those communications, by the way, were before I had any contact with Hillel. That was my initiative. I know some people try to portray this evening as some sort of grand scheme by Hillel to disrupt another event, but that was actually my view to them, and they said no, and I reached out, and I'm very fortunate. I was told that Professor Chaffetz would only be 25 to 30 minutes speaking, so we scheduled ours for an hour later. I know there are people in the room, so I just want to be on the record. That's why we're in separate rooms tonight. I would have been very happy to share a stage with somebody I disagree with vehemently on this issue, and I think that would have been the better way to have handled it, considering it was a university-sponsored function, not a privately sponsored function. But enough about that. I'm going to talk to you about the academic boycott movement. I'm going to give you a little history of it. I'm going to explain to you what it means. And I'm going to explain to you why I believe the proper position is to be against it. But I want to put, for the students here, particularly for the students here, in perspective what's going on with the boycott movement. Because I understand from my interactions with students, it's very easy for you to get down if you're a supporter of Israel on campuses. That there are people who shout at you and they build mock walls and they do things like that. But the reality is that in the United States as a whole, Gallup just came out with a poll, and Israel's favorability rating is higher than it's ever been. It is far surpasses any other state in the Middle East. It's 72% favorability rating. Palestinian Authority is, I think, 19%. I think Iran is 9 or 10%. It's like, who are those 9 or 10% people? So you live in a little bit of a bubble, and I just always want students to understand that what you're seeing happening on campuses is not what's happening in the United States as a whole. Unfortunately, it's closer to what's happening in Europe, but that's a different question. By way of comparison for favorability, in doing a little research for tonight, I viewed some other favorability polling. Admittedly, it wasn't Gallup, so the methodology may not be apples to apples here. But compared to 72% favorability, kittens have 71% favorability. So Israel is doing better than kittens in the United States. So since we're doing so well, we're better than the little fur balls. Why are we even talking about this? Well, we're talking about it because it's a serious matter. Whether it's spread or not, it's a very serious matter. And bad things start small. That's history. And we want to address them when they're still small in the United States so that we don't become what Europe is today in terms of the boycott movement. I'm going to start my presentation actually at the end of the discussion. And the end of the discussion is, if all of the things they say about Israel are true, and they're not, and I'll talk about that, if all of those things were true, should we be engaging in an academic boycott? I'm not talking about if you want to boycott Sabra hummus because the parent company somehow is connected to the Golani Brigade. I think that's the reason. The Golani Brigade, by the way, the commander-in-chief of the Golani Brigade is an Israeli Arab Druze, not even Jewish. The Arab Druze in Israel have the highest participation rate in the army, 82%. Just a little aside. So if all these terrible things they say were true, should we be engaging in an academic boycott? And I would suggest to you that no. And in fact, the majority of universities, in fact, every university that's spoken out on it has said no. Major academic organizations have said no. And I want to do this in a couple of ways. One, I want to relate to a personal anecdote from my own life. When I was in college, I went to Hamilton College undergraduate. I was a Soviet studies major. And I studied Russian language through Middlebury College and through Hamilton. And I traveled multiple times to the Soviet Union. That would be in 1979, 1980, and then my wife and I went in 1984. We traveled alone throughout the country, which was very unusual. And I realize they probably don't teach this to younger people, but think of the Soviet Union, the forced collectivization of the peasantry in the Ukraine, in which multiple millions of people starved to death. The Gulag Archipelago, the extensive prison system stretching out into Siberia, where people would just disappear into it. The deportation of entire nationalities. You've probably never heard of the Crimean Tatars. You may hear of the Crimea today because they're thinking, well, will the Crimea secede from Ukraine with all this trouble? Because the Crimea is a mostly Russian part of the country. Well, it's mostly Russian because in 1944, Stalin put the entire population of Crimean Tatars on trains and trucks and shipped them out to Siberia and to Uzbekistan. That's why it's mostly Russian. The Baltic states, the captive nations, actually independent nations that were taken over by the Soviets. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. The invasion of Finland, you've probably never heard of by the Soviets. The invasions of Hungary and Czechoslovakia in the 1960s, the so-called Prague Spring, which ended badly. The lack of academic freedom, the fact that you had to be a party member to achieve anything in their Communist Party member in their system. If you expressed any sort of dissent, you would lose your job. Lack of freedom of movement. You needed an exit visa to leave. The wall in Berlin was not to keep people out, it was to keep people in. The invasion of Afghanistan. I was actually on the last flight with my Middlebury College group, flying to the Soviet Union when the US closed the Soviet consulate in New York City because of the invasion of Afghanistan and suspended Aeroflot's flying rights in the US. We were on the last flight out to Moscow with the Soviet diplomats who had been kicked out. And you know, the funny thing is, back then, nobody was talking about an academic boycott of the Soviet Union. It was just the opposite. We wanted to go there. We wanted to interact with their faculty. We brought their faculty over to Middlebury for the summers to teach us. Now, we understood what the game was. We understood they were all approved by the Soviet government. They probably had to report on each of us when they got home or while they were there. We understood all that. But we viewed that academic interaction as so critical to bringing freedom to the Soviet Union. Now, our little group of 10 students in a dormitory with 800 students, mostly from the Third World, I attended an institute to train foreigners to teach Russian. So I was ostensibly going to become a Russian language teacher. The interactions were invaluable. And I'd like to think that that whole interaction between our society and their society at the academic and university level was a really positive force in the changes that wouldn't be for another 10 or 15 years that eventually swept over the Soviet Union. And so I think one of the reasons I reacted so viscerally to the academic boycott movement is it's the exact opposite of what I knew from my own experience to be the wrong way to go. And I've covered the boycott movement for years. I've covered their flash mobs in stores, don't buy this Israeli product, don't buy that. I've covered their disruptions of the Israeli Philharmonic in London. I've covered all those things, but none of them got the reaction from me that this did. Because one, it hits home, it's now in my world. And two, I just knew from my experience with the Soviet Union, it was the wrong thing to do. Second thing, anecdote. I'm not a big fan of Thomas Friedman in the New York Times. I don't know if you read him. But he actually had a really good column the other day. And it was really a good column, mostly because he didn't opine too much. He just reported. And he reported on something that's going on through Technion in Israel. They're doing a MOOC. I don't even know what the letters stand for, but it's basically an online class that anybody can attend. It's the next wave if you haven't heard of it. And Technion, a professor at Technion, is putting on a MOOC on nanoscience. And as of the day of Friedman's column a couple of days ago, 4,800 students from around the Arab world, including the Palestinian territories, have signed up for it. And there's all this excitement. The students, according to the article, range, and it's being conducted in Arabic, by the way, range from Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, Algeria, Morocco, Sudan, Tunisia, Yemen, the United Arab Emirates, and the West Bank. Iranians are signing up for the English version of it. And the professor is quoted in there who's doing this, is that Technion is funding the project, which took 9 months to prepare, and this professor is donating his time for the lectures, and he points out that some 19% of Technion students today are Israeli Arabs. Think about that. Think about all the negativity you hear about the Israeli educational system. 19% of Technion are Israeli Arabs. It's not in his article, but the valedictorian at Technion's medical school last year was an Israeli Arab woman. Up 9% from 12 years ago. The professor goes on and he says, if the Middle East was like the Technion, we would already have peace. In the pure academy, you feel totally equal with every person, and you are appreciated based on your excellence. Well, the one thing I've left out of there is that the Israeli professor is an Israeli Arab professor at Technion, who's saying that if we could replicate what we have at Technion, an Israeli Institute of Higher Education, one of the premier institutes in the world for science and the sciences, we would have peace. And that's the institute they want to boycott. That's the institute they're organizing, including a professor at this university is organizing to stop the Cornell Technion campus in New York City. This beacon of where you could have cooperation between Jew and Arab, between Israeli of any religion and the Arab world. That's what they want to snuff out. And under their guidelines, participation in that would be forbidden. So those are just two anecdotes. Who gets hurt by the destruction of this academic freedom? You've got the target of it, in this case Israel. You've got the targeters. You've got the people engaging in it. And you've got innocent bystanders. The history of the boycotts is something you can't ignore. The earliest boycotts in the then British Mandate of Palestine were against Jews. Documented, I've seen the news clippings, at least as early as the 1920s, 25 years before the creation of the State of Israel. There were anti-Jewish boycotts. The Arab League boycott. Students here probably don't know about the Arab League boycott. Arab League was formed, which was of countries, Arab countries, was formed in 1944. The Arab League boycott started in 1945, before Israel was even a country. They were boycotting the Jews in Palestine. But the modern boycott movement has its genesis, what we now call the BDS movement, has its genesis in the 2001 Durban NGO conference, which was so anti-Semitic that the US walked out on it. deceased Congressman Tom Lantos attended that conference. And I want to just read you what he wrote about it. Another ring in the Durban circus was the NGO forum taking place just outside the conference center. Although the NGO proceedings were intended to provide a platform for the wide range of civil society groups interested in the conference's conciliatory mission, the forum quickly became stacked with Palestinian and fundamentalist Arab groups. Each day, these groups organized anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic rallies around the meeting, attracting thousands. One flyer, which was widely distributed, showed a photograph of Hitler and the question, "What if I had won?" The answer was, "There would be no Israel." At a press conference held by Jewish NGOs to discuss their concerns with the direction the conference was taking, an accredited NGO, the Arab Lawyers Union, distributed a booklet filled with anti-Semitic caricatures, frequently like those seen in the Nazi hate literature printed in the 1930s. Jewish leaders and I, who were in Durban, were shocked at this blatant display of anti-Semitism. For me, having experienced the horrors of the Holocaust firsthand, this was the most sickening and unabashed display of hate for Jews I had seen since the Nazi period. Sadly, but perhaps not surprisingly, the official NGO document that was later adopted by the majority of the 3,000 NGOs in the forum branded Israel a racist apartheid state, guilty of genocide, and called for an end of its racist crimes against Palestinians. The resulting document issued by the forum is the template for the modern BDS movement. It is the template in which they decided to brand Israel an apartheid state and to use that as their mechanism. And that's what you're seeing on campuses today. What you are seeing, whether the people doing it or not know, is a direct outgrowth of the strategy developed at the anti-Semitic NGO forum in Durban in 2001. And they don't even understand how they're being used by people who don't have pure motives. I believe that a lot of the people, particularly in the US and on campuses, don't understand the role they're playing in the greater movement to destroy Israel. But if you look at the history, you cannot deny where it started. The next 3 years were spent organizing quote-unquote Palestinian civil society. So in 2003 and 2004, the people who had attended and conducted the Durban conference started to get Palestinian civil society groups. And that simply means not the Palestinian Authority, but other groups, to issue calls for a boycott. And that finally coalesced in the July 2005 final declaration of the boycott. That declaration, the direct outgrowth of the Durban conference, is the declaration and the resolution to which the American Studies Association has committed itself. And that is the declaration that is then set forth in guidelines also issued in 2005 by the Palestinian Campaign for the Cultural and Academic Boycott of Israel. Those are the guidelines to which the American Studies Association has committed itself. And I want to go through those guidelines for you. You can see how deep the international academic boycott wants to reach if it has the power to do so. They're directing people to refrain from participation in any form of academic and cultural cooperation, collaboration, or joint projects with Israeli institutions. A complete cutoff. Now, some will argue, well, that's just institutions, that's not individuals. Well, who makes up institutions? If someone were to boycott Ithaca College, they're boycotting the professors here. They're boycotting the programs here. They're boycotting the students here. Continuing on from their own specifications, their own guidelines. And these are guidelines, by the way, if you read the American Studies Association material, and I have, most people have not, they specifically, in multiple locations, refer back to these. They prohibit attendance at academic events such as conferences, symposia, workshops, book and museum exhibits convened or co-sponsored by Israeli institutions. They prohibit institutional cooperation agreements with Israeli universities or research institutes. I mean, think about what that would do to the Jewish Studies Department departments throughout the United States if the BDS movement had its way. They're against any exchanges of faculty and students and conduct of joint research. They're against what they call study abroad, their word, schemes, study abroad schemes in Israel for international students. That means Ithaca College, I presume, most colleges have study abroad in Israel programs. Those are boycotted. My question for the American Studies Association and its supporters on this campus, will they boycott Ithaca College's own programs in Israel? You don't have one? Okay, well, most colleges do. Okay, most will. Most do. Will they boycott those programs? Will they boycott their faculty members who participate in those programs? Will they try to prevent students from participating in those programs? They want to ban addresses and talks at international venues by official representatives of Israeli academic institutions, such as presidents and rectors. They want to ban Palestinian/Arab-Israeli collaborative research projects or events, because they say it's widely known that the easiest route to secure a research grant for a Palestinian academic is to apply with an Israeli partner. They want to stop that. They want to hurt the Palestinian academic also. They want to ban institutional membership of Israeli associations and world bodies. And last but certainly not least, and this to me is in many ways the most chilling, they want to ban publishing in or refereeing articles for academic journals based in Israeli universities. I mean, it's practically book burning. This is what the ASA has agreed to, because the actual resolution passed by the ASA, not their guidelines, not their talking points, and they actually have document talking points for faculty, says it is resolved that the American Studies Association endorses and will honor the call of Palestinian civil society for a boycott of Israeli academic institutions. So that is what they have adopted by binding resolution. Even they got pushback from supporters of the BDS movement. And what happened is, as they moved towards their National Council vote in early December of last year, they started to issue guidelines, because this was even too much for people who were in favor of the boycott to stomach. And they issued guidelines which don't really say we're not going to follow these, but they issued guidelines that say, well, we're only going to boycott institutions. I've already addressed that issue. They said, well, we're only doing this because we've been asked to by Palestinian civil society. So if somebody asked you to boycott U.S. universities because we're located on indigenous people's land, and there was certainly a genocide against Native Americans, would you boycott yourself? You don't hear anybody volunteering for that. So they issued these guidelines, and every time they say, we don't boycott individuals, but they will boycott anyone who's a representative or an ambassador of an Israeli academic institution. So if you're the assistant dean for academic affairs, assuming there is such a position at Tel Aviv University, you're automatically boycotted. They will not deal with you. If you're an Israeli academic and you go to their meetings, you're going to have to represent that you're there only in your individual capacity, that you're not there as a representative of your university. For no other nationality, for no other national origin, is that litmus test imposed. Not for Iran, not for Saudi Arabia, and I don't think it should be for them. I would welcome interaction with Iranian academics and with Saudi Arabian academics and anybody. I'd welcome interaction with Palestinian academics. But nobody goes through the litmus test that an Israeli has to go through, that you have to represent that you're not there as a representative of your institution. And there's no end to the boycott. If you look at even the ASA guidelines, the question is asked, well, when does it end? And they said, that's a difficult question to answer. And who do they refer you back to? They refer you back to the organizations that generated the guidelines I just mentioned to you. So whenever the ASA says that they've got their own special guidelines, they're not adhering to the international boycott, yes they are, because they're adhering to it, including as to when it's going to be declared to be over. So whose academic freedom is violated here? The question I asked early on. It's a little bit of a trick question because it's everyone's academic freedom that's violated. Obviously it's the Israelis' academic freedom. Israeli Arabs, Israeli Jews. If you're Israeli, if your national origin is Israeli, you're subject to this and you're subject to discriminatory treatment. That's the easiest one to see. Well, yes. And their response is, well, we don't care about the Israeli academic freedom because we don't like them anyway and they're bad people. But is that really where it stops? And when you start to think about how far it goes, you can understand why the president of this university and president of almost 250 other universities and major organizations have come out against this. Who else's academic freedom is boycotted? Well, the academic freedom of other faculty at U.S. institutions. Because if this boycott were adopted by their universities, as they want it to be, their ability to interact with Israeli institutions, their ability to conduct joint research, their ability to interact with the Israeli Arab professor running that MOOC throughout the Arab world would be interfered with. U.S. scholars would be prohibited in many ways. The general academic community would be impacted severely. Just think of how many advances in science and other areas and medicine come through this joint cooperation internationally. The academic boycott is not a victimless crime. It's not like boycotting sabra hummus. If you don't want to eat sabra hummus, don't eat sabra hummus. But when you do an academic boycott, you impact everybody around you, everybody in the university, everybody in the scholarly community, not just your intended target. So if you don't like Israel, you still should be against the academic boycott. Who else is most impacted by this? Students. Faculty, I can guarantee you, they don't tend to think very much about how their actions are going to affect the students. But you're impacted. Your abroad programs, your ability to study, your interactions. You're a victim of this academic boycott as well, whether you like Israel or not. And I don't think faculty have the right to do that. I don't think faculty, for their ideological reasons, have the right to dictate to students who they can interact with, what programs they can participate in, what career paths they can follow, where they can go, who they can talk to, what they can read. They don't have that right. And that's the same reason why, as much as I don't like the regime in Iran, I would be dead set against anyone at Cornell who tried to stop our cooperation with Iranian academics, who tried to stop, I don't know if we have any, but any programming with Iran. I know we have programming with Arab countries. I would be absolutely against that, because we don't have the right to tell students what they can and can't do intellectually. That goes against the very fabric of the university. I'm for academic self-determination for students. How does that sound? Of course, where does it stop? I've mentioned to you, we're sitting now on indigenous lands. The U.S. has committed its fair share of, I don't want to call them necessarily crimes, but problematic actions abroad and in the U.S. We've had slavery here, we've had segregation here, we have lingering effects of it, we've invaded other countries. Why aren't the people who are boycotting Israel also boycotting the U.S.? They're happy to get their salary from a U.S. university, but they're not willing to walk the walk, they'll talk the talk. They should resign if they're so dead set on their principles, that colonial powers, if they're so dead set in their post-colonial and anti-colonial theory that they are unwilling to have academic freedom for Israelis, then they should resign. They should boycott themselves. I'll read to you something that Henry Richmond, who was the chair of the American Association of University Professors. Students here may not know that. I think it's the largest organization of professors, about 50,000 professors, has been at the forefront of fighting for academic freedom, at least in my reading, at least since 1915. Here's what he wrote about the ASA boycott. In 2006, the ASA adopted a resolution condemning the U.S. invasion of Iraq, noting among other things that the invasion threatened academic freedom, whether in Iraq, the U.S., or both is unclear. Were I, meaning him, an ASA member, I surely would have supported that resolution. It wasn't a boycott, it was a resolution. Yet the ASA did not even consider an academic boycott of American universities in response to the American occupation of Iraq, as they now do in response to the less murderous Israeli occupation of Palestine. You can note, Richmond is not like a rah-rah, go Israel kind of guy, okay? He probably is a very harsh critic of Israel. Well, some might say they can't really advocate a boycott of themselves, can't they? So why is Israel singled out? Of all these nations in the world, where horrible things take place, where women are oppressed, where religious and ethnic minorities are oppressed, where there's no academic freedom, why are they not singled out? Well, they say, well, like I said, because we were asked. And whenever I hear that, I can't help turning into a parent. And I can't help thinking, well, if they asked you to jump off a bridge, would you do that too? The academic boycott has to be judged on its own merits, not just because somebody asked me to do that. Little side note, why do you think this was organized as a call from Palestinian civil society? The reason, I believe, is that the U.S. has anti-boycott laws that apply to country boycotts. So it's organized as a call from civil society, not as a country boycott. Those anti-boycott laws don't apply. They say, well, U.S. aid to Israel. We give Israel so much money. Therefore, we have a special obligation to punish Israel when it does something wrong. I done a little research yesterday on aid to countries. Do you realize that per capita, the population in the world that receives the highest per capita international aid are people the UN classifies as Palestinian refugees and people living in the West Bank? By far. It's not even close. But let's look at the U.S. The U.S. gives $3 billion a year in almost completely military aid to Israel. I looked at the number, and it's like $30 million that's not military aid, and the rest is military. Well, the inside story of military aid is that it's essentially a subsidy for the U.S. defense industry. Okay? They give Israel $3 billion, and almost all of it comes back to Lockheed Martin and Boeing and all the other manufacturers to keep our assembly lines going because they need to keep them in production, whether it's tanks or it's airplanes or whatever it happens to be. So that all comes back to the U.S. There's a significant portion of it that is joint military research projects, like the Iron Dome and the, can't remember, something Sling and all these different things, which will ultimately benefit the U.S. So that's Israel. They get no economic aid whatsoever. It's military aid, and it almost all comes back to U.S. manufacturers. Palestinians from the United States get, it varies year to year, but ballpark, about $440 million a year. Obviously, very little of it in military aid. Per capita, Israel's ahead of the Palestinians, but not by as much as you'd think. If you did the math, and Israel's population is roughly 4 times, maybe 5 times what the population in the West Bank is of non-Israelis. The Palestinians, if you did the math per capita, they're getting roughly the equivalent of $1.5 billion a year in U.S. aid. And almost none of it comes back to the U.S. So I don't buy this thing that, just like they asked us to do it, I don't buy the notion that we have some particular duty to punish Israel because of our military aid, when we're giving about half as much to the Palestinians, and it's not even coming back to the United States. They say that Palestinian education is repressed. How many universities were there in the West Bank and Gaza prior to 1967? 0. There are now over 20. Under Israeli, whatever you want to call it, occupation, etc., Palestinian education has flourished. It's not perfect. There have been problems, particularly during the suicide bombing campaign. They had to construct the separation barrier. They had to set up additional checkpoints. I'm not saying that's something that's necessarily pleasant, but to say that Israel has repressed and suppressed Palestinian education is just not true. It's actually flourished under Israeli control. There were joint programs. There are claims that there are visa problems when American academics want to go to the West Bank. At the Modern Language Association, there was a resolution put forth to condemn Israel for arbitrary interference with the travel of academics to the West Bank and Gaza. They ended up dropping Gaza from it because somebody pointed out, well, you know, actually Egypt controls part of the border, so how are you blaming only Israel for that? But so they left it as, but then they took out the word arbitrary, because one of the professors, who was a former president of the Modern Language Association, said, what's your data? Okay, you're making an accusation that Israel arbitrarily stops people. Where is your data? And all they had was about 5 or 6 anecdotes spread over many years. And this professor said, well, you know something? The rate of visa denial for Americans wanting to go to the West Bank was some tiny percentage. I mean, it was less than 1%. It was this infinitesimal percentage. It's 10 times higher for Israeli academics trying to come to the United States. It's harder for an Israeli academic to get the proper visa to come to the United States than it is for an American academic to get the proper visa to travel to the West Bank to attend a Palestinian university. It passed, barely, but only after they'd taken Gaza out of it, only after they'd taken the word arbitrary out of it. Israel is not perfect. I'll be the first to say it. But you can't view its imperfection in isolation. There's no other country that has faced that terror threat. There's no other country that has been under siege, that has been under boycott since even before it existed as a nation. And one of the things, I didn't get to hear what was said in the other room, but I've heard many speeches by many people. I've heard them by Marwan Barghouti, or whatever his first name, Omar Barghouti, the founder of the boycott movement. I've seen video interviews with the founder of Electronic Intifada. I don't remember what his name is. You'll never hear them mention anything about the terror against Israel, about the hostility against Israel, about the lifelong attempts to invade and destroy Israel. You'll never hear, guess who started the war in 1948? It wasn't the Jews. It was Arab armies invading from all over the Arab world, as far away as Iraq and Saudi Arabia came to drive the Jews into the sea. And there were refugees created on both sides. There were, depending what number you take to be accurate, at the time it was estimated 400,000 to 600,000 non-Jewish Palestinian refugees. Now somehow that's up to 1 million. Pretty well documented that about 600,000 to 700,000 Jewish Arabs, Jews from Arab countries fled to Israel. What you had was an exchange of populations. You'll never hear any talk about that. So why really is Israel singled out? I think we know why Israel is singled out. Because there has been, for a century at least, a refusal of the Arab world to accept a Jewish national entity in the Middle East. And that's just the reality. That's why I think Bibi Netanyahu is correct in saying that part of a peace deal has to be a recognition by the Israelis that there'll be a Palestinian state, a homeland for the Palestinian people, and by the Palestinians that there's going to be a Jewish state. A Jewish state, by the way, the UN General Assembly resolution in 1947 referred to the creation of a Jewish state and an Arab state. At that time, they didn't refer to Palestinians because they were viewed as just part of the larger Arab nation. But the UN used the term Jewish state. If you use that now, they're going to accuse you of being a Jewish supremacist. I think that's the new fashionable word. So why was there this reaction from the academic community? As soon as the ASA boycott passed, 249 presidents, I keep waiting for number 250 to send me the email saying, here we are, have condemned this as a violation of academic freedom. The American Council on Education, which essentially represents every higher educational entity in the US, over 1,700, has condemned it. The American Association of University Professors, the group I mentioned to you that fights for academic freedom, has condemned this boycott. These organizations and the university professors and presidents, rather, have been the adults in the room. The kids want to fight, or at least one of the kids wants to fight. And they're saying, hold on a second. There's a bigger issue here. There's a bigger picture. As university president, I represent a lot of constituencies. I don't just represent the people who want to go at it and fight with each other. And there are bigger issues. Ithaca College, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Roshan, issued a statement which is very typical. And there's nothing, I don't want to denigrate it. It's not extraordinary because it's great, but it's typical for what university presidents have issued. And I know there's a claim out there that the Israel lobby is behind this. The Israel lobby is not behind it. As soon as this passed, I, and someone who helps me with the blog, who's here tonight, started emailing universities and saying, what's your position? And they started emailing us back. And it got to the point that people were just emailing us that we'd never contacted. You know, the director of communications at XYZ University, attached to the statement from President so-and-so, would you please put us on your list? There was this collective feeling that a line had been crossed. And that has continued. And that's why you've seen this. And what are they really afraid of? One, I think they believe what they say about academic freedom and how this impinges on it. But you know, it's easy to start this, but where does it stop? Do I now organize a boycott of the professors at Ithaca College who disagree with me on this issue? Because I find their viewpoint offensive? Do we now pass legislation like is pending in a few states to clamp down on this at universities? Where does it stop? Is that really what we want to do, is turn the universities into political battlegrounds? Some people would say, yes, that is what we want to do. But the adults in the room, the major organizations, the presidents have said, no, that's really not in the interest of the overall academic community. Before I close my statements, I really feel obligated, and I hope I haven't gone on too long already. You know, I started off by saying, if everything they claimed about Israel were true, should you support the academic boycott? And the conclusion I come to is no, you shouldn't. But I have to tell you, so much of what they say is not true. And I just want to quickly run through 6 or 7 of the things they claim that are not true. Israel is an apartheid state. Well, we know what apartheid was. It was the subjugation in South Africa of the black majority, not just the black majority, the supermajority, by whites, based on race and based on racial classifications. If you look at how apartheid is defined in the Convention 1973 against apartheid and the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, crime of apartheid means inhumane acts similar to those referred to in paragraph 1, that's lists all sorts of bad things countries can do to others, committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. in the convention in 1973, for the purpose of the present convention, the term "the crime of apartheid" shall include similar policies and practices of racial segregation and discrimination as practiced in Southern Africa, and it then goes on to list specific types of acts. Until the BDS movement, it always has been what we all understood it to be, this unique crime against humanity of racial domination and oppression. But if you look at Israel, it is one of the most multiracial, multi-ethnic states in the entire world. Forget for now the Arab population, the Jewish population. Helen Thomas, the reporter who passed away, famously said in one of her last taped statements, well, the Jews, they should all just go back to Germany. They don't belong in Palestine. Reality is that half of the Israeli Jewish population is not of European origin. They're the refugees from Arab countries during the 48 war and the years immediately after it. They're rescued communities from Ethiopia, from Yemen, from all over the world. It is a multiracial population of Jews there. The Israeli Arab population, roughly, or I should say non-Jewish population, is roughly 20%. Even that has Druze and Bedouins and people we would refer to as Palestinians. They're multi-religion. There's no place in the Middle East that religion is as tolerated as it is in Israel, minority religions. Would you rather be a Muslim in Israel or a Jew in Saudi Arabia? Of course, that's a trick question because Jews aren't allowed in Saudi Arabia. But you'll never see the Human Rights Council of the UN condemn Saudi Arabia. So to call Israel an apartheid state is just propaganda, and it's the propaganda that was devised as their mechanism at the 2001 Durban conference. The apartheid wall. This is, unfortunately, Israeli Apartheid Week in the US. And on a number of college campuses, they've set up mock checkpoints, and they'll set up mock walls. The one thing you'll never see at those mock checkpoints or mock walls are mock suicide bombers. Because if all Israel wanted to do is steal, quote unquote, steal land, do a land grab, or all it wanted to do is make life miserable for the Palestinians, why did they wait until 2003 to start constructing it? Well, they did it because in 2002, when Yasser Arafat declared the Second Intifada, which we now know was pre-planned, over 450, I believe 457 Israeli civilians were killed in suicide bombings. You've heard of Sbarro Pizza Restaurant, Passover Seders. Hamas even managed to get a bomb into the cafeteria at Hebrew University. When they started constructing the barrier, which mostly is a fence, it's a barrier in it's a wall in areas where they were concerned about sniper fire and about pot shots being taken. But most of it is a fence. That number of victims of suicide bombings was cut in half in a year, cut in half after that. It's now down to essentially nothing. And yes, I'm sure the checkpoints do make life difficult for people. But you know what? Yesterday, someone was caught at a checkpoint with 6 improvised explosive devices, similar to what was very effective in Iraq and Afghanistan. About a month ago, someone was caught with an advanced German anti-tank rocket. It's unfortunate that Israel has to live under that and has to, because of that, construct a barrier. I was in Israel in 1980. There was no barrier between the West Bank and Israel. We traveled freely everywhere. Yes, you had your bags checked when you walked into stores and on buses, because that was the threat. But so think about it. If all they wanted to do was some evil intent, why did they wait so long? And the reason is there's no evil intent behind it. It was a necessary reason for defending themselves. Israel's engaged in ethnic cleansing, they say. Well, if Israel is engaged in ethnic cleansing, it's the worst ethnic cleanser in the history of mankind. Because the Arab population, both within Israel and the West Bank, has grown dramatically in the last 70 years. The Arab birth rate, until recently, when its Jewish birth rate has caught up, in some ways surpassed, has been always ahead of the Israelis, Israeli Jews, I should say. That's not ethnic cleansing. What you have is a classic Middle Eastern ethnic and religious battle that's fought in many countries, and far less severely by Israel than by others. They say Israeli control of the West Bank is illegal under international law. Actually, that's not true. That's a disputed issue. And you can find legitimate. I'm not going to tell you that it is absolutely legal. What I can tell you to a certainty, though, is there are legitimate arguments on each side. You may not know this, but when Israel captured the West Bank, they captured from somebody who was illegally occupying the West Bank. Israel was designating the West Bank as part of Palestine, was designated as the Jewish homeland by the League of Nations in 1922. And when Israel declared its independence, Jordan illegally seized that land. And the armistice line left Jordan in possession. Jordan then purported to annex the West Bank. Only 2 countries in the world recognized that annexation. It was rejected by the entire international community. Britain recognized it, and Pakistan, newly formed Pakistan, recognized it. So when Israel captured it in a defensive war, you probably don't realize this, Jordan declared war on Israel in 1967. That's a common myth out there, is that Israel's first strike was against all of the Arab countries. It was actually only against Egypt. Syria and Jordan then joined the war. So Israel recaptured land under international law designated as part of the Jewish homeland from an entity that had illegally occupied it. And people have disagreements on what that means under international law. Last but not least, and then I'm going to finish, the claim all the time, well, there were 30, 50, 100 Israeli laws discriminating against Arabs, and that shows it's an apartheid state. I doubt anyone making that statement has actually looked at the list and then looked at the laws. I have. And most of them are what in the US we would call disparate impact. Okay? It's a law which on its face is neutral, but somebody is arguing it has more of a negative impact on African Americans than on whites, or on Asians than whites. And one of them, I just, getting ready today for this, I pulled one of them that is on the list of these discriminatory laws. And it's an Israeli law passed in 2011 that authorizes the government to revoke the citizenship of anyone convicted of treason. Neutral. The argument is that since Israeli Arabs are more likely to be convicted of treason, this is a discriminatory law. And that's what you get. And so what I'm going to wrap up by saying is that the academic boycott is counterproductive. It cuts off relationships. It damages everybody. And by the way, it's not going to force Israel to do anything. But it's going to hurt Palestinian academics as much as Israelis. And that's why I'm against it. And that's why I'll continue to be against it. And I'm going to be happy to appear at any college willing to have me. Thank you very much.
All right, guys. Thank you. Q&A. If you have questions, and I know that you do, this is the time to ask them. I understand that it's been a while, but we have a scholar in residence, so now is the time to address your questions.
Could you clarify, you said that the violations of international law, which are against Israel, include most of the Fourth Geneva Convention, are disputed. What that means to have a disputed violation of international law, and how those violations are disputed rather than in fact considered in the international court to be violations, including Resolution 242, saying that occupying the West Bank is illegal under international law. How is that disputed?
Sure. That's a good question. That's something that comes up a lot. And it's one, if I had more time, I would have addressed in my primary talk, but there's only so much we can cover. Resolution 242 doesn't say it's illegal. It says Israel shall return territories, not the territories, not all territories. And Eugene Rostov, who is an American diplomat involved in drafting that, has written, that the original draft proposed by the Russians and others said that Israel had to retain all the territories. And the Western powers would not go along with that, because they didn't feel that Israel had to return all the territories. They only had to return so much as would allow them, as the resolution says, to live within secure and defensible borders. So the language of 242 does not declare Israel's territorial capture to be illegal. It actually leaves the whole situation very vague. And that's why I don't think 242 applies. In terms of the International Court of Justice, that's an opinion that's very often cited too. I've actually read it. It's like 200 pages. I've read the additional opinions by other judges there. And what you have to realize about the International Court of Justice, it's just an advisory opinion. It's not like the U.S. Supreme Court has declared something and it's now the law of the land. The International Court of Justice can only issue advisory opinions, and they can only issue advisory opinions in the way in which the question has been asked to them. And there's only one group that can ask them a question, the UN General Assembly. So the anti-Israel UN General Assembly put a question to the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion. And that advisory opinion was, with regard to the separation wall, considering the occupation of Israel of these territories, please advise us on whether this is unlawful under international law, based on the record we're giving you, the findings of this UN panel. Well, those were biased UN findings. So essentially, it was a rigged question. They asked the question to rule on international law, but based on a factual record which was biased. And in fact, one of the judges wrote a separate opinion. I can't remember what country he was from. And he said, well, wait a second. I kind of agree with the majority on what international law means, but I don't feel that Israel, that we've gone about it the right way. We have this record that has not allowed Israel to justify the separation barrier based on its security needs, and that was the central question before them. Instead, they had a factual record which limited what facts the court could consider. So those are the arguments why it's disputed. It's an advisory opinion based on a rigged question and a limited factual record which Israel was not allowed to supplement and fully defend itself.
My name is Patrick Stevens. I'm from Cornell University. I just want to say a couple of things. Make a couple of comments about what you said. First, I want to thank you very much for giving some sense of historical perspective of what can happen. There's an old Yiddish question that goes like this, basically: what will be the end of it? What will happen as to the end of any of these actions? And we know where they can lead in extreme situations in history. But I think your going over the history is very good, especially for this group. My role at Cornell is in the library, and I'm actually selector for Jewish studies. And I buy a number of books from Israel, as you can imagine. I just want to let you know, I want to promise you that I intend to continue doing that with great pleasure. You know, I believe very much in the academic freedom you're talking about. I sometimes see things on the shelves that are very disappointing to see. Sometimes, as the saying goes, I have to hold my nose, and I still have to buy it sometimes. But we do it because we do it for academic freedom. And so, in working with Israeli materials, I'm only too happy to see them come in, of course. It's extremely important that we keep these information flows going. This is what we're about. You've addressed that very nicely. So I'll leave it at that, except to say that, in closing, that yes, I am partisan. Yes, I am a Zionist Jew. And I am certainly glad that the Israeli state is where it is. It's a startup nation. It's done a lot of good in the world, a lot of good to people who need it. You only have to look at what the universities have done there. And so any cooperation that can go forward between Israeli institutions and other institutions around the world, I think will be for the good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You mentioned that the U.S. gives a lot of money to Palestine and the Palestinians. Does the U.S. taxpayer know what happens to that money?
Palestinian Authority has a long, sordid history of missing money. I can't tell you what's happened to the money we gave them, but the EU announced, I think it was in November or October, that $2.5 billion, I can't remember if it was $1 billion or billion euro, were missing of EU aid. And that's one of the problems, that a lot of the aid that's given goes to Swiss bank accounts, or to subsidize Yasser Arafat's wife in France, or just to line people's pockets. They don't have those sort of controls. The Palestinian water issue, every month there seems to be some new issue. Now it's water. There are hundreds of millions of dollars in unspent water project funds that have been donated by the West. And nobody knows where the money is, but it's not being spent on water projects. Yet then we hear complaints that Palestinians don't have as much water as Israelis. Well, yes, because they're not spending the international aid that's been given them. So I don't know. I presume the U.S. tracks it, but I can't tell you precisely. Great, it's late, thank you, and feel free to visit my websites, College Insurrection, which is geared towards college students, and Legal Insurrection.
Thank you.